On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies, which today features Professor Dirk Moses. We at the Leve Center would like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. And I am personally grateful to the Leve Center staff for their great work to make these kinds of events possible. Our discussion with Professor Moses is the first in a series of events co-sponsored by the Leve Center and UCLA's cluster course on political violence in the modern world. The cluster program offers team-taught interdisciplinary courses for first-year students on big ideas of great social significance. Our political violence course encourages students to think comparatively about the causes, dynamics, and legacies of mass violence. And each year, we feature 3 case studies. This year, students are learning about the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, and French colonial violence. Given our topic, I thought immediately of Professor Moses and his recent book, The Problems of Genocide, when it came to organizing this series. Before we get into our discussion about the book and related issues, let me introduce Dirk Moses briefly. Dirk Moses is the Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he's taught since July 2020. He was born in Australia. He was educated there, in the UK and in the US. And in fact, he got his PhD just up the road at University of California, Berkeley. His first book was the award-winning German Intellectuals and the Nazi Past, published by Cambridge. And since then, he has written extensively about genocide and global history. He's edited numerous collections, including Empire, Colony, Genocide, the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies, Post-Colonial Conflict and the Question of Genocide, the Nigeria-Biafra War, 1967 to 1970, and the Holocaust in Greece from 2018. As I already mentioned, his latest book and the main focus of our discussion today is The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security and the Language of Transgression, which appeared in February of 2021 and is available through Cambridge University Press and wherever books are sold. So welcome, Dirk. It's great to have you here virtually.
Great to be here with you, even on the other side of the continent.
Yes, exactly. So before we turn to the problems of genocide, specifically the book and the issues, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your intellectual itinerary. You've worked primarily in 2 fields, it seems to me, 2 broad fields, German intellectual history on the one hand and comparative genocide studies on the other hand. So could you talk a little bit about how you became interested in those fields and how you see them as related to each other?
Sure, happy to do so. So as Michael said, I hail from down under, from Australia, where I did my BA at the University of Queensland. And then I did a master's at St Andrews in Scotland and an MA at Notre Dame and the PhD at UC Berkeley. So that was an itinerary that got me interested in these issues. More autobiographically, my mother's German, my father taught German history at the University of Queensland. So, German history was present in the household and in the extended family on one side, with all the related issues, for the Second World War and the Holocaust and so forth. And including, a close colleague of my father's in Israel, Walter Grab, who established the German history at the University of Tel Aviv, whom we visited in 1977, I think. I was a little boy. But I remember parts of it quite well. So that was embedded in the biography. And then, of course, growing up in Queensland in the 70s and 80s as a boy and then an adolescent, made one conscious of Indigenous issues, which were current. And by the 90s, there was a more intensive debate in Australia about genocide in relation to Indigenous people. It's not something scholars had spoken much about. I mean, certainly there'd been research on frontier violence and these things, but not using the genocide concept. But there was a controversial report that came out in 1996 about the stolen generations, about the practice and policy of forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families and then putting them in institutions or adopting them out. And this had come to an end by the 60s, early 70s. and although it varied from state to state, and caused enormous damage and trauma, a bit like the residential schools in the US and particularly in Canada. And this was a commission of inquiry about this, and one of the allegations in it was there was genocide. So by the late 90s, there was a heated debate about that while I was a graduate student in Germany, where I was doing my research, and where I was doing research on German intellectuals in the Nazi past. And when I got back to Australia, I started to teach a course on genocide. So I got my first job, very lucky and rare by today's standards, at the University of Sydney in 2000. And there was no course on genocide, so I decided to do one. And there was no book that I could set. I mean, there were not with the genocide concept. So I edited a book on it, which came out in 2004. And I ran a conference in 2003 on sort of global history of genocide and colonialism that Michael attended, and where we met for the first time. So that's 18 years ago. I mean, time flies, right. And here we are. In any event, but already while I was at graduate school, I'd started writing a little bit about the case in Australia, because I had studied Australian history and frontier history as an undergraduate in Australia. So these were always parallel and intersecting interests, partly biographical, partly because of where I was studying. But the moral impetus for the German case was obvious, and anyone who was young or a student in the 80s and the 90s, was preoccupied by the historians' dispute, the Historikerstreit, about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and German public memory. So, I was in a sense writing the prehistory of that in my book and earlier in the dissertation. But I thought, as an Australian, it's inadequate to in a sense lecture the Germans, which foreigners love to do, lecture the Germans about their past and make sure they're doing it properly and so forth, and not do it to your own country. And in my case, Australia. Okay, and so that was also an impetus to move in that direction. Now, I wasn't conscious necessarily of the intersections of those projects until later, which maybe we can get to.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And there's a lot of resonance for me in my own trajectory coming from the US, in this case, not Australia, but with similar issues of genocide and slavery and the way those became intertwined with my own interests in the Holocaust. So I really can relate to that quite strongly. And I've been thinking a lot about that conference in 2003. I forgot quite how long ago it was, on colonialism and genocide. And it was really ahead, I think, from my perspective, at least, really ahead of its time. And the issues that were raised there are still ones that we're very much discussing. So I'm fascinated by the fact that you trace this strong intellectual and personal interest in the topic of genocide. Clearly has very obvious personal and political stakes for you, as it does for me and many others. You're also the editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. And I think you're widely recognized as one of the leading international scholars of comparative genocide studies. And yet your new book is called The Problems of Genocide. And that's not just a fancy title. It's you mean that very seriously. The book is really dedicated to a pretty critical exploration of the very concept of genocide. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you got to that and what you see as the particular problems of the genocide concept?
Sure. Happy to do so. I'll back up a bit to sort of continue the autobiography, because that gives you an answer to some extent to your question. So I became interested in the intellectual history of genocide as a concept as I was working on these colonial cases, because as many of us saw when you read Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented this concept during the Second World War, he referred to settlement projects as part of that which constituted genocide, because he observed that in German policies in Poland, where he was from, for example, they would remove Poles and Jews and then settle them with German or ethnic German colonists, farmers and so forth. And this was widely observed among his contemporaries. So everybody observed this in the 1940s, right? And many people were writing about it. And I talk about that in chapter 4 of the book. And he then incorporates that into this new concept called genocide. And for many of us, we thought, well, this looks like settler colonialism, which is a form of colonialism in which the settlers come to replace one society rather than to exploit the the natives, right? Now, in practice, the Nazis were doing both. They wanted to keep a helot class of slave laborers and so forth, but they also wanted to thin them out, as it were, and replace them with Germans who would then be in the demographic majority. So we were interested in using the concept of genocide and Lemkin's ideas, his broader ideas, because they were narrowed when they became international law in 1948, for the cause of indigenous genocide recognition. And that was something I was committed to for quite a long time. I was telling Australians and other members of settler societies, look, our societies were founded on genocidal origins. Now, as you say, 18 years ago, this was not that common. I mean, obviously, indigenous intellectuals had been saying this for a long, long time. Okay, but we're talking about different scales or different spheres, right? This wasn't a mainstream conversation in the academy, nor was it a mainstream conversation in the public sphere. I mean, people were ignoring indigenous intellectuals, and to some extent, I was trying to help out. Okay, as a in my own clumsy way, and I was incensed when I saw indigenous intellectuals venture these ideas in the public sphere and be either ignored or told, what are you talking about? That's not genocide. The Holocaust is a genocide. No, they don't look the same. So ergo, shut up. This is not a genocide. You're lucky that we brought civilization to you. So, in a sense, reinscribing colonial mentalities. In any event, it's these kind of blockages in the recognition endeavor that I was engaged in that got me thinking, maybe the concept really can't be stretched. As political scientists use this term of conceptual stretching to make concepts more capacious so you can fit more cases into them. And, that's what I was trying to do. But by about 2010, so, 8 years after that, 7 or 8 years after that conference, and after I'd done 3 edited books on genocide and colonialism, I saw that this isn't really sticking. And to the extent that indigenous people, but not just indigenous people, also other groups that claim they're victims of genocide, try to play the genocide recognition game in international public sphere domains and the national ones as well. The dice is loaded against them because there is an archetype or an ideal type behind the genocide concept, and that's the Holocaust. And what I try to do in the book is explain how and why that occurred. Because in the end, although I may sound like somewhat of an activist, I am a historian, and I have old-fashioned historian questions, which is how and why are things as they are. So leaving all politics aside, how do we end up with this concept of genocide, which is very new when you think about the political vocabulary that we've inherited in the West? Where words like security and empire and so forth all have Latin roots and go back thousands of years, right? Genocide is, just a few decades old. It's 70 years old or so, right? So how did we end up with this new word when, for quite some time in human history, we'd been making do without it to talk about human suffering, to talk about state violence and excess and so forth. And how and why did genocide become such a global word so quickly? So on the one hand is the thinkability of genocide. How did Lemkin and how and why did he invent this concept? That's one thing. The second thing is how and why was it adopted so quickly? Because people invent new concepts all the time, but doesn't mean they get adopted, right? Now, in retrospect, it looks inevitable that there was this humanitarian hero, which he sometimes called Raphael Lemkin, who has his own Holocaust survivor story, which is wrenching, and he lost 49 members of his family in East Central Europe, and suffered and so forth, was clearly traumatized. It makes him a personally appealing figure. Why, how and why does it become a humanitarian hero, constructed as such? So the historian, at least a good one, who thinks in genealogical terms, does not buy into stories of inevitability, that we had to have this concept, nor does it buy into the proposition that genocide is a natural concept that exists out there. That is, there's a reality of genocide out there, that genocide names that. I mean, the literature scholar that, Michael would, this is a bread and butter thinking, right? But not for historians who are often realists. in that, and international lawyers too, they think, well, genocide is not invented by Lemkin, it's discovered. Like it was already out there, and he just sort of put a name on it to a praxis that was age old. And anyone educated in the 90s, has Foucault in their bones. Although I never cite Foucault, and I as a personal touch, I don't like name dropping, theory dropping in my texts. I just operationalize these ideas and footnote the literature and the facts. So, I mean, that's the historian rather than someone in cultural studies, I guess. And in any event, we're interested in how and why concepts can be formulated and then break through, right? So they're the two impulses. And that's what the book's dedicated to. Now, just to answer your question about the actual problems of genocide, I mean, I've hinted one. One is that there is this effective hierarchy in international criminal law and in memory, with genocide at the top as the crime of crimes, and which it's often called. Actually, in international law, there is no hierarchy between war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. But in practice, there is, and certainly in public memory, right? And that's why people use the term like the crime of crimes. Okay. Now, what I have been observing is that when groups allege that they're victims of genocide, and then it's found through public discussion that they're not, because it doesn't resemble the Holocaust, as I mentioned before, then people shrug their shoulders and go, well, it's not so bad. It's bad, but it doesn't shock us. We'll get to that issue of shocking the conscience of mankind when we discuss the language of transgression, right? So what I see is that quite a lot of state violence, in fact, most state violence, gets a free pass because it doesn't measure up to this sort of monumental threshold, which is set by the Holocaust. Okay, so that's a real big problem of genocide. Another problem is that there's this specious but common foundational, in fact, distinction that's made between types of violence. One is that which is supposed to resemble the Holocaust and is therefore genocidal, and that's when people perceive that victims are killed solely on the grounds of their identity, killing Jews just because they're Jews. They're innocent victims, they have no agency. In that sense, it's not a political crime because there's no political interaction between victim and perpetrator. They're killed solely on the grounds of their identity. Whereas, according to this line of thinking, everyday, common, banal, the violence that is more regularly observed against civilians is political violence, because there's a nexus between the victim and the perpetrator in the following way, where we're talking about a civil war or a rebellion or an insurgency or any kind of armed conflict where the victims are not victims because they were targeted on the grounds of their identity, but because they or some of their number are engaged in a political conflict. And this is the way people reason this through. They say, well, in the case of Biafra, which I pointed to, which was a secessionist civil war in Nigeria in the late 60s, the federal military government was trying to prevent a secession by the Igbo. And in doing so, they blockaded the region, and several million people starved to death, along with other causes of mortality. I mean, we're massive numbers, staggering numbers. But they were trying to end the war and secure victory. They weren't killing them because they were Igbo. It was because of the military conflict. And they contrast that with the Holocaust, where European Jews, especially German Jews, were not involved in an insurgency, a rebellion, or a secession against the German state, which is true. They weren't. Okay, so that distinction in circumstances really has led to this distinction in the way we conceptualize violence. Now, I have a whole chapter in the book on the Nazi case where I point out that, in fact, all these cases, even the Holocaust, are governed by a security logic, but we'll get to that. I know you have a separate question on that. But the point is that in the politics of recognition, victim groups try to portray their circumstances as Holocaust-like, That is, the Armenians, we Armenians were being targeted during the First World War solely because we're Armenians. Whereas in response, the Turkish state, then as now, the Ottoman state then and the Turkish state now, say, no one was being targeted because they were Christian or Armenian, but because there was a rebellion or a security threat in the context of a foreign invasion, but from the Russians in the east and from the Allied forces through the Dardanelles in the south. And we had to remove Armenian populations from the frontier or from the battle areas because they, were loyal to the opposition. And so this has got nothing to do with race hatred. It's got everything to do with a security emergency, and it's getting out of this standoff that you see in explaining how and why mass violence takes place that I want to, I wrote this book. Now, let me just give you two current examples which delineate or identify or highlight this conceptual impasse. Myanmar, when the Rohingya, in China, and in Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs. Now, in both cases, you've got states that say, we are engaging in mass incarceration in the Uyghur case and in mass expulsion in the Myanmar case, not because we have any racial antipathy to these people, although that may exist in the general population, but because the members of that group are insurgent separatists, and we have a legitimate right to secure the situation. In response, advocates on both sides, that is Rohingya advocates, who are mainly in Bangladesh now, that's where most of the refugees are, and Uyghurs, who I've met at conferences and have corresponded with and so forth, they all try to shoehorn their case into a Holocaust paradigm. And I've seen articles and edited articles where Holocaust analogies are constantly being made, although few of these scholars actually know much about the Holocaust, but they have images in their head of what it is. And I point out to them, do you really want to go down this path? Because your case does not resemble the Holocaust. Sorry. Okay, these are all very distinct circumstances. There may be something else that binds them, which is the security paranoia. But the practice is very different. So I'll defer to another part of our discussion. What I mean by permanent security, because that's what's coming up. But in any event, what I'm seeing is this real blockage in the way we conceptualize mass violence, and the convenient way states can say, we aren't engaging in genocide because we're engaging, in fact, in a security operation. And then an international law allows them to do that.
Right, and that's what I wanted to follow up with. So do you see the problem with genocide, or the first problem with the genocide, coming in the enshrinement of this category in international law and the somewhat limited way in which it was defined when it was enshrined? As you trace in the book, there were various concepts of genocide, even within Lemkin's own work, and that sort of gets pushed in a particular direction. Can you maybe say a word about how that legal definition shapes things as opposed to some of these broader concepts?
So Lemkin had a very broad definition of genocide in this book, Access, Rule, and Occupied Europe, that he wrote really 1942, 43, but it was only published a year later for various reasons, late 1944. And he was writing this book along with many other emigre scholars. He was just one of many who were trying to influence the Allies as they conceptualized war crimes trials, which were already in the mix, being discussed, because people could see that inevitably the war would be won, and we would put the Nazi war criminals on trial. But under which laws? That was all very fluid at the time. So Lemkin was trying to propose a new law by augmenting the Hague Conventions from 1899, 1907, which governed military occupations of foreign states. Not what you did to your own civilians, but what you did to other people's civilians, right? And international law was sort of being developed at the time, and he was contributing to that with this new concept. Now, he made it very, very broad because he wanted to include what we would now call persecution, which is now included as a crime against humanity, and cultural genocide and so forth. He wanted to make it very broad in order to capture the Nazi policies towards Slavs and Jews, or towards Christian populations and Jews, which had some overlap, but also some differences. The Nazis did not envision the total extermination of all Poles, Catholic Poles, all Christian Czechoslovaks, right? But they did with relation to Jews. Okay. Even if in practice many Jews survived, right? And they did make exceptions here and there, but the Nazi ideology certainly tended in this totalistic direction. So he wanted to thereby to fashion or forge a united front between the government in exile in London, the Polish government in exile and so forth, and the World Jewish Congress, who were all lobbying the major powers for war crimes trials. And the World Jewish Congress and these Christian states, if you want to call them that, were not friendly to one another, because the Polish government in exile, for example, along with the others, didn't want the World Jewish Congress to represent their Jews. The World Jewish Congress wanted a seat at the table along with these governments in exile to negotiate these war crimes indictments and these new laws. And they said, no, well, we represent, the Poles would say, no, we represent Polish Jews, you don't. You're a non-state actor. So there was a lot of tension there. And Lemkin observed this. And he also observed that there actually was little interest in the Western press and in Western governments in what was happening to Jews. At the time, and this is what the wonderful thing about history, right? At the time, if you look at the documents and the press and so forth, Western states, like America, regarded the Nazis mainly as an anti-Christian campaign, not as an anti-Jewish one. I mean, obviously they folded that in, right? But they regarded it as a pagan movement, if you like, the Nazis, who were suppressing Christian states. I mean, the majority of all these states were, after all, were massive majority Christian populations, and they observed that the Nazis were shutting down churches and incarcerating Polish priests and so forth. And certainly, diaspora organizations like the Polish diaspora organizations in America were letting everyone know that, the Polish nation is the big victim here, or the Czechoslovak nation is a big victim here. And Polish Jews too, they're victims, but as Poles and as Jews, right? So Lemkin saw this, as well as also, anti-Semitism that was behind this lack of interest in what was happening to Jews. So he forged, if you like, a very Catholic, in the sense of a small c Catholic, broad church concept in order to unite the Christian and Jewish experiences. Now, this was all far too broad if you include, cultural genocide and persecution and so forth, in this very capacious concept of genocide. This is all much too broad for the powers, for state powers, when they meet in 1946, 47, 48 to thrash out a genocide convention, because they all want to engage in assimilation of indigenous populations and put down rebellions, communist or anti-communist and so forth. And so, Lemkin sees this too. I mean, he understands how international politics works and agrees that we should dump cultural genocide. And there were many other compromises that were made along the way, like the removal of political groups from as a protected group. So it really boils down to ethnic, racial, and religious groups who are killed as such, purely on the grounds of the membership of their groups. In other words, in this apolitical or non-political way, modeled on the Holocaust. So the Holocaust becomes much more tightly tethered to the concept of genocide as it's negotiated international law. And what I argue in the book is that this is done on purpose by states in order to set the threshold of that which is shocking and requires intervention so high that they can actually do more or less anything they want. So rather than seeing the Genocide Convention as a progressive measure that humanizes international relations, I see it as a tactic by states in order to allow them to engage in the state violence that they usually engage in all the time when they need to anyway.
It's fascinating, and it's a very strong and provocative and important critique. I mean, I can hear in the some of the language you've been using a reference to what you call in the book the language of transgression, and you have this long, fascinating historical discussion of this idea of the language of transgression. Could you sort of clarify a little bit what you mean by that and how that fits into this story you've been telling?
Sure. So that's the first part of the book, and it's a term I invented, the language of transgression. Anyone, again, trained in the 90s was fascinated by the linguistic turn and the languages. But those of us who studied intellectual history, particularly in the Cambridge School version, were influenced by John Pocock's work on the languages of republicanism, which is also in my first book on post-war West Germany, where I identified two rival languages of republicanism that were in tension with one another and led to a particular form of memory and political regime in Germany. In any event, what I was struck by in reading the sources, and once again the sort of historian's fascination with just the primary sources and then just seeing what you find, right, was the commonality with which I saw were this phrase, shocking the conscience of mankind, or versions of it, in documents hundreds of years ago, but also in the UN Security Council debates about Syria in 2015, 16, 17, when Samantha Power was there representing the Obama administration. They would use this, for me, very antique language. They would maybe replace humanity, mankind with humanity, shocking the conscience of humanity. But this, versions of shock, conscience, or staining our conscience, and humanity as a sort of this entity, were just peppered the documents, especially humanitarian documents. For example, it's in the preamble to the UN Declaration, or the General Assembly resolution, sorry, that calls for a genocide convention in November 1946. It's also in the preamble, a version of it, of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And if you look at various international conventions and agreements on slavery, on suppressing slavery, you'll see this kind of language, have our consciences having been stained by this, ignoble practice, we hereby stamp out the crime, the practice of slavery. That kind of thing.
Very familiar. It's very familiar.
Yeah. So I said, okay, where does this come from? This phrase, shocking the conscience of mankind, and I traced it back after various conversations with colleagues. I traced it back to Las Casas's polemics, exposés about the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the middle of the 16th century. He wrote these short texts in the 1540s and 50s, I think, which became a European scandal. They were quickly translated into Dutch, into English, and other European languages, along with etchings by various engravers, which depicted in what we would call atrocity imagery today, massacres and exploitation and so forth. So there's a visual history to the language of transgression as well, which has continued today in the fascination with atrocity photography and its impact on people's humanitarian sensibilities. And so in two long chapters, over about 90 pages, I trace the incredible stability of shocking the conscience of mankind from a Christian idiom where mankind is imagined as Christendom, if you like. Although there is a concept of even non-Christians being part of a humanity, which is a conception that goes back to the Stoics. It has Roman and even Greek roots. Well, first Greek and then Roman roots. And this is where colleagues in classics can help out. You sort of talk about your ideas over a coffee, and they go, "Dirk, you really need to read the Stoics." Who are the Stoics? But off you go to the library and educate yourself. But was it Aristotle who said, I'm a citizen of the world? That kind of thinking, that there is a world out there that we have a solidarity with, or a commonality with, beyond our city-state.
Wait, so what's the problem? It sounds good. So what's the problem with this?
Okay, now it has it's Janus faced. So on the one hand, when people are genuinely shocked by something, and they're in these colonial scandals about the East India Company in the late 18th century in England, or about the Belgian Congo in the 1890s, which were an international scandal as well about the conditions in the Congo, which were less about massacres than about labor exploitation. And so slavery, or anti-slavery, abolition, is a big part of the story. Is this in a sense is good, right? On the other hand, it's a very Orientalist language. It's very much the civilized judging the barbaric. Okay, and usually it's the non-Europeans who are the barbaric, and it justifies imperial expansion by alleging shocking crimes by Indians or by Native Australians or so, Aborigines and something. And we need to intervene there. However, it can be turned around, as it often was, whether by Indigenous actors who appropriated this language and said, or by members of European elites, like during the Enlightenment, Kant, Herder, and various others, said, actually, the barbarians are we Europeans. We have a higher level of technology, and look at all the massacres and exploitation we engage in. So it does lead to a sense of self-consciousness, critical self-consciousness among all actors are concerned. Now, what I show is that massacres and labor exploitation are elements, the primary elements in this story until well into the interwar period, when there was forced labor, not slavery, but forced labor in the British and French mandates in Africa and so forth. And there were massacres there as well, and this led to periodic scandals, and then therefore if you like, a lightening of the colonial style of governance. But when the Holocaust comes, and people are eventually shocked, right? Mainly with the liberation of the camps, people could see there's newsreels and the terrible imagery, and European sensibility. It takes a while. I mean, there's moments of shock in the 40s, but it takes several decades. This is something that Michael's an expert on. You have various moments, the Eichmann trial, the early 60s, and various other trials in Germany in the 60s, and then various episodes in popular culture where it takes about 50 years for Europeans and the West to really get, oh yeah, this was pretty shocking, and maybe we need to rethink some of the elements of our civilization, right? But that sets the bar of that which shocks the conscience of mankind so high, so much higher than before, and then it's institutionalized in the concept of genocide that very little measures up to that. Mm-hmm. And so the language of transgression, in a sense, has been escalated, and in an ironic and unintended effect, a concept like genocide, which is meant to humanize international relations and domestic affairs, is actually led to the opposite. It's led to the ability for states to say, look, we're engaging in a security operation here, and expelling an entire population, or incarcerating an entire population, or starving an entire population, like in Biafra. And it's not genocide, because it doesn't look like genocide. The Holocaust is the genocide, and people tend to agree, because the Biafra and the Igbo don't resemble Jews in many ways. Mm. I mean, if the Holocaust, and this is also related to interests that both Michael and I have, if the Holocaust is unique, singular, and so forth, as so many people say, well, then nothing else measures up, and then you're stuck with a threshold of shock, which is impossible to reach.
Yeah. Is it only the threshold? I mean, I took part of your argument to be that it's this repetitiveness of the language, especially when it's applied to deeds perpetrated by Europeans, is that in fact this kind of violence is endemic to Western European, modern, whatever you want to call it, civilization, right? And so what we claim to be shocked by is in fact so much a part of the worlds that we all inhabit. Am I misunderstanding you there?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, at some point we will integrate the security language argument, and that might make it more clear. But there's no doubt that, as many colonial imperial historians have pointed out, I'm just sort of working off their labors, is that for empires that were animated or justified in the name of humanitarianism, like the British Empire in the 19th century, whose navy patrolled the seas, trying to stamp out the slave trade, right? After it had been abolished I think in the UK in 1806, and then eventually in the 1830s, and it has various phases. In doing so, they're of course they're increasing the ambit of their empire, and meanwhile they're engaged in permanent colonial warfare in Africa and other parts of the world, and expanding their empire, all in the name of civilization, conquering barbarism and savagery. So this language of barbarism and civilization, it's very dangerous for people who are coded as civilized or barbaric. But the language of transgression here is justifying that, because although the British themselves engage in many massacres and so forth, their self-understanding and the image they portray is that we are stamping out terrorism and banditry, and for example, in suppressing the so-called Indian Mutiny in 1857, right, with tremendous violence, but it's civilized violence because it will lead to peace, after which we can have commerce, Christianity, ordered relations, and so forth. So it, as well as providing rhetorical devices for critiquing empire, it's also a legitimating force. So it's always complex, but you have to sort of look at how it plays out in each circumstance.
Makes sense. So I want to turn in 1 second to the concept of permanent security, which I think is sort of the linchpin, in a way, in essence, of your argument. But before that, just one follow-up on this language of transgression. How, and this is something that I just wondered a lot as I was reading the book, is how would I understand the critique? It's very convincing of the language of transgression, this repeated shocking of our conscience. How should we respond? What kind of language should we use when we're faced with something like what happened in Biafra, or what happened in the Holocaust, or what's happening today with the Uyghurs, or any of these other cases that you've been mentioning? In some sense, I want to say they're all pretty shocking. We should be shocked, right? But I can see the problems with the language. So how do you suggest, can we develop an alternative language, or what's the solution, in a sense?
Yeah, well, historians are always reluctant to provide solutions because we're just historians, right? There clearly is a normative agenda in this book, but in the end, I'm not a moral philosopher, not a political scientist, and I can't read the future. The incredible stability of this language, over many hundreds of years, makes you wonder that you're not going to be able to excise it from our, expel it from our vocabulary or from our language. I mean, this language is set in stone in many ways. However, what you're getting at is something that I agree 100%. We need to retrain our moral sentiments and our categories, our perceptual categories, which are linked to affects, to emotions, so that we're shocked by far more than just something that resembles the Holocaust, right? And that's why the cover of this book, if you can see that, is this family who were killed in a Saudi airstrike in Sudan, in Yemen, in 2015. And the artist here, Murad Sube, who's a unbelievable street artist whose work I recommend to you all, is drawing on the ruins themselves the images of the haunting images of the victims of this part civil war, part international conflict, of which there are now many, and America is implicated by having sent ordnance to the Saudis. They're trying to dial that back a bit now. Now, why is it that these kinds of victims, who are victims of collateral damage, as they call it, who are victims of a military logic rather than a genocidal logic, why aren't they remembered in our mnemonic regimes, right? Why do people shrug their shoulders and go, war is hell, that's just one of those things, right? Everybody was upset here when the Washington Post, or was it the New York Times, broke the story that retributive airstrike, or perhaps they say preemptive drone strike against alleged terrorists in Afghanistan after the terrible checkpoint bombing were revealed to be civilians, seven children, right, who were delivering water and not ordnance, right? Now, that did shock people, but it's now been quickly forgotten as well as the news cycle moves on. Now, what I'm getting at this book, among other things, is that this constant killing of civilians as collateral damage through airstrikes, and mainly airstrikes or drone strikes, since the global war of terror was unleashed 20 years ago, has added up to quite a lot of people, right? But because it's low intensity violence compared to genocide, like 10 people is not a million people, right? And occurs often without the knowledge, or within the it's not on TV, the sight of Western publics, that it's beneath our radar perceptually and conceptually. It doesn't shock us in an enduring way, at least to the extent that it would lead to, serious policy changes or a public movement or an outcry. This must stop. Over the horizon capacities is something that Biden has committed himself to, military capacities, because if you withdraw the troops, you still need to be able to bomb people, right? From afar, that way you don't imperil any of your own troops. You just imperil the civilians on the other side. So this style of punitive expedition, if you like, is something that has deep colonial roots, because that's how all empires, and Western ones as well, have expanded over the last 500 years, is through punitive expeditions against alleged insurgents, perceived insurgents, who resist your presence. Okay, and international law, I'm arguing, which was invented first by the Christian powers, then became international law after the Second World War in particular, but maintained all these traditions, has allowed this kind of killing of civilians as collateral, because states want to arrogate to themselves the right or preserve the right to wage armed conflict in that way, and because Western states, or all states, have expanded their borders that way. And so they're very, very keen to maintain a distinction between an illegitimate genocidal logic and a legitimate military logic that does cause civilian casualties. I mean, were there any prosecutions for the policy makers and implementers for the mass murder of Japanese civilians in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, for the 2 million Korean civilians of American saturation bombing in North Korea in the early 50s? I don't think so. And it's not even on our radars. I mean, there was an anti-nuclear movement for a while, but it's all but disappeared. Why aren't these on our radars? Why aren't we shocked by these? These are a lot of people. And this practice of killing collaterally through mainly aerial bombing is built into the DNA of international law. Now, here and there, it's been adjusted, but it continues today. And I think it needs to shock us. Why it doesn't shock us is something that it's worth discussing.
Right, for sure. And now, so again, I think in making this argument and you do try to find an alternative language, certainly an alternative language to genocide. And what you propose is this concept of permanent security. So tell us what you mean by that. Security sounds like a good thing, right? So why is permanent security a bad thing in this story?
So I do contrast, everyday security, regulation security with permanent security. Now, it's not a warm and fuzzy concept. It's a deeply utopian concept, because no one, whether a state or an individual, can have absolute safety. If you want to have absolute safety, then you can't live with other people. You can go and live on an island on your own, right? But then no one can threaten you, right? But that's illusory. Obviously, that's a kind of autism, if you like. And we have to think of other ways to live together without engaging in mass criminality. Now, where does this concept of permanent security come from? I take it from the trial transcript of the prosecution of Otto Ohlendorf, a German Nazi Einsatzgruppenleader of Unit D that was engaged in the mass killing of Jews, I think 90,000 Jews, in one of these special action units, Einsatzgruppen, that came in behind the Wehrmacht as it moved through Eastern Europe in order to suppress any potential partisan warfare, because partisan warfare was a big problem for the Wehrmacht. And Stalin had called for a general partisan uprising against the Nazi invaders. So in other words, getting Soviet civilians involved, which was a no-no in international law. And so, and against the culture of, military culture in all armies at the time. Now, so it was a kind of these were preemptive killings. Now, the thing is, the Einsatzgruppen ended up targeting Jews, and not just Jewish men, but women and children. There are various phases throughout the second half of 1941 when the invasion of the Soviet Union commences. And in the trial, the prosecutor asked Ohlendorf, why did you why did you kill Jews? He says, we're engaged in not just regular security, but permanent security forever. And he says, but what's that? Why would you kill women and children? They're not combatants. Jewish men, maybe they could be combatants, but not the women and children or old people. And he says, you have to understand that permanent security isn't what you think, just, keeping control of a space while there are hostilities. We are building 1,000-year Reich. I mean, we want security forever. It's permanent security. And that means you have to kill the women and the children because they will grow up, at least the children, and become partisans. And when I saw that, I read that, I thought, it's chilling and shocking. On the other hand, it reminded me of the nits make lice argument that you see in colonial documentation about the expansion of the colonial frontier, when Native American children are slaughtered by frontiersmen, by cowboys and settlers and so forth. They used exactly the same rhetoric. And if you look hard enough in global history, and I have many of these cases mentioned in the introduction, the killing of children preemptively, so they don't grow up to oppose you, is quite common. It's quite common, more common than you think, unfortunately. And what it tells you is that there is a mode of security, a paranoid mode of security, a hypervigilant mode of security, which is concerned with the future, not just the present, but the future. We have to guarantee the future, which means you need all once and for all solutions, so that never again can there be a threat to our rule. And that means you need to kill people entirely, or deport them entirely, or incarcerate them entirely. Okay, so that's permanent security. But rather than adopt his concept, I adapt it and I flip it back onto the Nazis and anyone else who engages in this kind of logic of preemption in the following way: is that yes, one can recognize that the Chinese state has a legitimate security imperative to prevent secessionism of Xinjiang, and to arrest anyone who's a terrorist, if you like, or a separatist. Likewise, there were a number of Rohingyas involved in attacks on police stations in Rakhine State, right? That's not an illegitimate security operation. Like, put these people on trial, okay? It's a handful of people. But what you've done is incarcerated or expelled an entire population, because you're thinking, oh, if we do that, then never again will we have this problem. And that's permanent security, and it's completely illegitimate. It cannot be reconciled with any kind of human rights norms, because you're engaging in collective punishment. You're punishing people who are not involved in this. You are identifying them solely on the grounds, in this case, of their ethnic affiliation or national affiliation or religious affiliation, for what the Germans call Kontaktschuld, which means guilt by association, okay, or potential guilt, right? So that's what I'm getting at. Now, there are two versions of permanent security, which are very important to distinguish, although they are also united. One is illiberal permanent security, where it's perpetrated in the name of an ethnos, the German people or the Chinese people, and so it's limited in space. Okay. The other one is perpetrated in the name of humanity and has its globe as it's unlimited. It has its globe as its ambit. And that's Pax Britannica in the 19th century and Pax Americana since the Second World War. We are engaging in these acts to make the world safe for democracy, to extend freedom for everyone, not just for us, right? So what this means, for example, is that American policymakers decided to lay waste large parts of Vietnam in the Vietnam War in the late 60s or the mid 60s on into the early 70s in order to keep you safe there in California, or your parents safe in Peoria, Indiana, or wherever it is, somewhere in Kansas, right? You were imperiled by South Vietnam falling, according to this security logic, right? Now, it's completely outlandish. In fact, you weren't imperiled, okay? But if you have an image or fantasy of security, which means dominating the entire world, setting up hundreds of bases throughout the world, and then saying they are intrinsic to the national interest, you will necessarily be drawn into a style of military conflict in which civilians will be dying en masse. Now, it's not genocide. Okay, and this is how I get out of this conceptual impasse. People did try to say that, like Sartre, that the French philosopher, that the Americans were engaged in genocide in Vietnam, and he wasn't the only one. This came from the left, but it didn't stick. I mean, there was an international debate about this, and I talk about this in the book, but it didn't stick. It didn't look enough like the Holocaust, and people argued that. They said, this doesn't look like the Holocaust, it's not genocide. Ergo, what we're doing is legitimate, it's consistent with international law. Yes, there were a few massacres here and there, like My Lai, but these are just bad eggs. On the whole, our policy is sound. Now, well, according to this policy, it was legitimate to kill hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not more, of Vietnamese civilians as sort of collateral damage in the fight against North Vietnamese forces. And that logic is now also operative in the so-called global war on terror. But there, we're no longer engaged in, and I include Australians here, are no longer engaged in carpet bombing, and deforestation of entire regions through Agent Orange and napalm and so forth. Is much more surgical. Technology has allowed quote unquote surgical airstrikes, but we all know how flimsy the intelligence can be and how many civilian casualties there are. I mean, roughly. I mean, there are people who count this stuff, right? I mean, it's all highly secretive, but there are people who try to find this stuff out. And this is now, in a sense, something that might be difficult for some of the listeners to understand. Although genocide is the wrong concept, permanent security is the right concept, and it's something that you can therefore put in a broader frame with other modalities of permanent security. Because if you are engaged in a permanent form of warfare, these forever wars, these never-ending wars that people often talk about now, because terrorism is, a permanent fixture and threat to this globally conceived notion of security, right? Then you are engaged in the permanent murder of civilians because because the killing of civilians proportionately as collateral damage in airstrikes is not illegal in international law. Okay, so in other words, there's a permanent policy of killing enemy civilians preemptively in order to secure America and Australia. So killing civilians in these airstrikes, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, is done to guarantee our security. Now, I think that is in a level of fantastical delusionness that license us to speak about a kind of mania that we've seen and delusional thinking that we've seen in actual genocides, and we need to call it out.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm understanding correctly, and again, I think this is sort of the force of the argument, the direction it's going. You've crafted this concept or taken and adapted this concept of permanent security. And in a sense, it's a way of transcending some of the problems of genocide, or the way that the concept of genocide partitions different forms of violence against civilians. And it presents us with then a broader frame, which we can then start to think, we can think together.
Yeah,
genocidal and non-genocidal violence, right? If that distinction still makes sense. So
you get away from, is this genocide or not?
Right.
Which is a kind of a dead end.
Right. To kind of a broader underlying logic that unites these different cases, and that seems very powerful. And that kind of takes me to the last thing I want to talk about. We don't have too much time, but I did want to get to another kind of very concurrent issue, and it's one that's very closely related to the class that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion on political violence in the modern world. As I mentioned, it's a comparative course on both genocidal and non-genocidal forms of mass violence. And I have to say, it's a really wonderful course, and it's never struck me as something that should be controversial in any way. And yet there are certain places many places even, where this kind of comparative approach can become controversial. And especially when it involves the Holocaust and juxtaposing the Holocaust with other forms of violence. And in recent months, in fact, the two of us have been involved in a very public dispute, primarily in Germany, though with international implications, precisely about this question of comparing histories and memories of political violence. And you wrote an essay that was published in a Swiss online journal called Geschichte der Gegenwart, History of the Present. Your essay was called The German Catechism. And it's received both a great deal of acclaim, I would say, and also a great deal of criticism, both within Germany and outside Germany in the, let's say, the English-speaking scholarly world. Could you say, just as part of our concluding discussion, could you tell us a little bit what's at stake in this discussion, and how you see things unfolding and why they're unfolding in the way that they are?
Sure. I'll do this very briefly. So, I writing this essay didn't come out of the blue. What I was observing was how over the last few years, in Germany, there's been a particular ugly disciplining of non-Western voices, in particular, like the African philosopher Akil Mbembe, who was invited to a cultural festival last spring, so in 2020, and then these new anti-Semitism commissioners, which have been instituted in Germany since the federal parliament passed this resolution condemning the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement of the Palestinians, and effectively criminalizing it, to attack Mbembe for alleged anti-Semitism because he'd written a very few minor things, because it's not a central part of his work, on the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. And there was then an intense debate about this over the middle months of 2020. And then at the end of 2020, the translation of your book, Michael, which you wrote and published in 2009 on multi-directional memory, it's a very famous book, coming out in German, led to then sort of a second iteration of really the same debate about anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and so forth. Holocaust memory, and is the Holocaust unique, and so forth. And memory, and I don't need to repeat Michael's argument here because people know it, but Michael is very gently telling Germans that there are other ways of remembering than in a hierarchical way, but in an interrelational, interactional, or multi-directional way. And this set off a very ugly debate in which I observed not only the antipathy towards an African scholar by white Germans, but now Gentile Germans lecturing an American Jewish scholar about how to remember the Holocaust. And I thought, there's something wrong about this. There's something strange about this. And I became increasingly exasperated about that. And also the response to an article that Michael wrote with Jürgen Zimmerer about, comparative memory and comparative study of violence. Also, which was attacking certain taboos in Germany about comparison. Now, these taboos exist for a good reason, because in the mid 1980s, in the first historians dispute, certain conservative historians had said, let's stop singling out the Holocaust as something particularly bad and monumentalizing it, because the Soviet crimes were equally as bad. And after all, they preceded the Holocaust. The Holocaust and the Nazi regime is a response to Stalin and the Russian Revolution and so forth. That led to a heated, in some ways very interesting debate too, because you had historians at the top of their form and philosophers arguing with each other, not just journalists, people who actually knew what they're talking about. And this led to a new consensus in Germany by the end of the 90s, and that's what my first book is about ultimately, that the Holocaust is unique, and the remembrance of the Holocaust is central to the German memory system. And when I finished my dissertation in 2000 and the book came out in 2007, I thought all is well in Germany. But this is consistent with a opening up of Germany to multicultural voices, which was already a parallel debate about multiculturalism in the 90s, which I know Michael is interested in as well. Now, but then I moved away from German history, and I've only come back to it now in the last year or two, after observing that actually things haven't gone so well at all since about 2007, and that this memory regime has produced its dialectical opposite. So rather, while we're all in favor and welcome public and, if you like, vernacular memory of the Holocaust as well, the stepping stones, the Stolpersteine, or the tripping stones, which are often before German apartment blocks, where indicate the Jews who lived there and were deported and murdered and so forth, as a trigger to memory. Whereas we welcome that, what has happened since about 2007 is what I call a Verstaatlichung, the arrogation by the state of this memory regime, and making it very official and rigid, and making anti-Semitism a kind of ideology which empowers certain actors to go looking around for people who are anti-Semites and then to destroy their careers. And it's in increasingly diverse Germany. It's being used by not just people on the right, but also people on the left to attack Muslims and Arabs who aren't pro-Israel. And why would they be pro-Israel, right? If your parents are refugees or grandparents are refugees from Palestine, why are you in Germany at all? It's because you're not living in your home village or town. And why aren't you living in your home village or town? Well, that have to go back to 1948, right? Now, you can't talk about these things in Germany, in public in Germany. You will be cancelled as an anti-Semite. So there, the conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is all but complete. And what I was observing then was a particular authoritarian limitation of freedom of expression in Germany, where left-wing non-Zionist or a-Zionist Jews are being attacked as anti-Semites by Gentile Germans. And then if that's going on, then there's something wrong. And what I wrote in this article is that's pointing this out, that there are certain articles of faith in German public memory, not in scholarship, but in public memory, and that it's being enforced by people I provocatively call priests, in terms of a political religion, who are newspaper editors and some politicians. It's quite a limited group, but you don't need that many of them in certain leading newspapers and politicians and in the news, the TV shows, to be able to enforce some considerable discipline. And people do not enjoy an Australian Yahoo like me pointing that out. I mean, there's a lot of cultural arrogance involved in that. There's also just a lot of misunderstanding too. But unfortunately, everything I predicted in May has come to pass. But only yesterday, a Palestinian-German author, medical doctor, and journalist called Nemi El-Hassan was cancelled from the moderating a science show, not a politics show, a science show on a German television network, because she'd liked some Instagram posts by Jewish Voices for Peace. And this was considered support for terrorism in Israel, against Israel, which is outlandish, right? So that's the partial end of her TV career. And so, when I said that we have a crisis of free speech in Germany, because I've written various other articles about this over the summer, this is exhibit A. So I think the debate continues, and unfortunately, there's the emotions that are invested in a German sense of, we're going to protect the Jews and Israel, because our grandparents murdered them, is so intensely experienced that they can't think of other subject positions which are legitimate. For example, that the many Muslims and Arabs who live in Germany might not share that. But it doesn't make them anti-Semites if they aren't big fans of what Israel did to their family. Okay, and the Germans need to be able to distinguish these things and say, look, we all need to live together in a multi-faith and multi-cultural society. And there shouldn't be protests against Israel in front of synagogues, definitely not. Okay, but nor should promoters of Israel in Germany themselves conflate the Jews with Israel. Okay, so they're all playing a very dangerous game of territorializing a dispute in the Middle East into German politics, and that's confusing a lot of people.
So yeah, there's a lot. I agree with that. There is a lot for concern that's been going on, and it is a strange and kind of ironic twist to what is, what for many of us has been a model of a memory culture that has taken responsibility for its own deeds, and that is a very rare thing, as you know, as an Australian, and I know as an American. But something has happened, and things have gone in directions that are indeed, I think, also very, very kind of concerning. So there's a lot to think about. I'm really grateful to you for joining us. It gives us a lot in our class to think about political violence, and I think for a broader public also, who I'm sure will be interested in these issues. So once again, the book we've been discussing is Dirk Moses' The Problems of Genocide. Pick up a copy. It's a hefty book, but well worth.
It's a cheap paperback. It's only $35.
There you go. It exists in paperback. So thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Dirk.
Thanks so much for your great questions. It's a pleasure talking with you.